So today we're going to be reflecting on the first 60 days of this new administration.
It's only been 60 days?
This has been just 60. We're going to talk about what we've seen happen to date and kind of discuss what that could mean for our clients moving forward in energy and environmental industry in general. So I'd like to just start talking about the National Energy Emergency Declaration and what kind of implications we've seen in each of our sectors that we're working in. The National Energy Emergency Declaration really focused on expediting coal, natural gas, oil, hydro energy via emergency authorities to streamline the permitting process. How has that affected us in other industries?
So ECT itself is heavily within the renewable energy business. We do a tremendous amount of work with some of the leading national renewable energy companies. We see the importance of renewable energy. We see it we know that the future really does require us to have a holistic approach to energy, meaning we're going to need it all in some way, shape, or form. We know that there's the increase of need of the renewable energy to meet the demands of data centers and all these other...
For decades, energy demand was mostly stagnant. In the last 10 years, 5 years particularly, we're seeing that increase on a logarithmic scale.
Yep. 30%. We sit with just 30% increase just last year, into 2023 was renewable energy. It's key. So for us, it's really important, obviously for our business, but seeing the deregulation or the national ban on wind energy, especially offshore wind energy, and just the move away from what was really a hot market is pretty significant. And I don't see how they're going to meet demand by eliminating a certain sector of generation.
Well, I've heard it referred to as an energy addition and not necessarily an energy transition. Yep. Sorry about that. Dirk, did you have thoughts?
Yeah. No. Just last week there were two industry associations that talked about energy needs for the future, and to your 30%, they came out and said we need 35 to 50% new energy in our grid over the next 15 plus years. So kind of pushing back a little bit and bringing in coal and bringing in natural gas and all that. We're going to need that anyway. The solar industry is here to stay. I mean, the effort. Last year alone, I think they said something like 84% of new electricity to the grid came from solar and battery storage facilities.
Yeah.
I think what's interesting about some of that too is historically peak generation versus peak demand had some kind of expectation, right? That could be modeled and that could be anticipated by energy providers. With this new demand, it's high load flexible demand coming from data centers, coming from cryptocurrency, right? And that unpredictability in the market incentivizes things like battery storage so that you can release peak generation to account at that flexible demand. So I think that's really interesting and something maybe different that we haven't seen over the last decade is that historically it was conventional fuel source generators diversifying their portfolios with renewable energy. I think what may be an interesting trend is now seeing maybe a bit of the inverse, right? Renewable energy firms that are diversifying their portfolio with conventional fuel sources. So kind of maybe a return to the previous status quo.
Yeah, and I think they were worried. I think renewables got a bad rap for the intermittence. Sun doesn't always shine, wind doesn't always blow, whatever that component was, although I still think it was pretty reliable. But the battery storage is a game changer. It really takes that component out, that negative connotation with renewables out, because it does provide security within those intermittent.
Right.
Across all of our clients right now, we're seeing it's not just a standalone storage project or a wind project. We're seeing them called energy centers, and they have multi-dimensional energy resources within them too.
Well, and the reality is that coal plants, let's take coal plants for example, they have been coming offline continuously for a long time now. There are still a lot of coal plants that are still getting removed out of the system. And so even though some of that may come back online, those companies that run that are diversified. They have multiple different assets in multiple different places in the energy sector, and they're not just going to revert back to the way things were 50 years ago. They're going to continue with this progress, which includes diversifying their portfolios to have wind, solar, battery, et cetera. And on top of all of this, the reliability of some of these is also not as great as maybe the current administration thinks. So a good example is hydropower. Hydropower had been a reliable resource for a very long time, particularly out west. There's lots of dams in hydropower. They're not as reliable anymore because the hydrograph has changed. We don't see the big snowfalls that we used to see, and so that has changed how reliable that type of source of power can be. So this shift back into the other types of renewable is not going to stop because there's other driving factors behind all of this that is not going to allow us to go back to some of the traditional kind of power sources that we were used to.
Well, just the demand alone, if you think about the last 60 days, manufacturing, that's all we hear.
Right.
We're going to bring more factories to this country and reshore some of the factories that have left. We need that energy demand.
Yeah.
And it takes time to get power plants back up to
Correct.
scale. It takes time to build a nuclear, smaller facility. So I think it's quite bullish, I think, on the renewables for quite some time to come.
It's in everyone's best interest to have a resilient grid as well. So when we're talking about multiple sources of energy, whether that's fossil fuels or renewables, that really just builds our energy resiliency as a nation. So
To your point,
we need it all.
To your point, Dirk, I think there's some similarities and some key differences between today's market and the market in 2019, 2020 during COVID that we saw some challenges in energy generation, right? Mostly in the pipeline of procurement of those facilities that have been permitted. Talking to folks in the industry right now with panel manufacturers and inverters, I don't think we've diversified those markets already here stateside internally with some good production facilities so I think overseas procurement of those products won't be as large of a challenge this time around as it was during COVID. So I think that supports your statement of production and maybe keeping pace with that demand.
Part of that announcement that I mentioned last week from the Sarah Week there in Houston, Texas, was the tripling of the amount of energy materials panels built in this country already in the last 2 years. So I think the failure to get supplies, the failure for that equipment, a little bit silicon problems, but otherwise we're in much better shape this year than we were 3 years ago, 4 years ago.
Agreed.
Well, and the executive order is specific to building in federal spaces,
Yes,
right?
because
So
that's
that's what they can control. So that's the other thing to keep in mind here is there are a lot of state level goals for renewable energy that the states want to meet that they're going to be doing on a state level. So I think we can anticipate a lot of these projects continuing, just maybe not on federal lands and instead on state and private lands.
Well, the thing is with the tax credits, that's really what drives it, right? So in the Biden level 30% tax credit, it goes through 2025.
Yep.
Right? So we have all this year to kind of add that in, and if he doesn't bring that back, it really will be important to figure out how these projects can be successful without those tax credits, right?
do we want to continue to speak to the rollback of policies that did support the development of renewables while we're on this topic of the tax credit and how
That's one of them.
how that's
Yeah.
affected? Absolutely.
Well, the IRA coming out in 2022 the way it did, it bolstered already tax credit scenarios that we already had. So we've always had some tax credit consideration. It bolstered it significantly. Through 2035 is their sunrise or moonlight, however you say that experience is 2035. The experts lately, including a insurance provider that provides for tax credits that I just talked to last week, feels very strong that through 2028, 2029, it'll take a nightmare or a storm event to eliminate any of the tax credits. There's going to be a slight pause, certainly on the federal lands that you just mentioned. That'll probably end.
Yeah.
But the pause on these tax credits really, it brought in $80 billion of private investment.
You would think they'd keep them.
You would think
Well,
they
this
want to
is
keep that.
the
yeah.
differentiator
You gotta
between
keep 'em.
a
Yeah.
grant versus an incentive, a tax incentive too. So we're seeing that.
Well,
well.
there's even the point that a tax credit is not the same as the federal government writing a check.
Correct.
So if they were writing checks, they'd stop writing the checks.
Right.
Right.
But it's very different when it's just millions of dollars off of someone's tax bill. Then the adders. I mean, there's adders onto these. There's the 10% add-on for the brownfield
Energy
scenarios,
community.
energy communities.
Yes.
Now, I suspect with some of the backwards nature on DEI and some of those components in neighborhoods, we're going to see some of that fall away because some of it was energy community, disadvantaged coal mine communities. That, I think, will temper and slowly disappear to the extent it is where it is now. But I think the rest of it, from the brownfield use, the use of poor properties, battery storage on those sites, we're seeing, our clientele are certainly seeing a strong push to keep
And
that going.
hopefully states do fill in, right? There's going to be
yes.
states that are still going to have to meet a certain amount of renewable energy. You would hope that they continue supporting those developments and continue to push it forward.
Yeah, go ahead.
That's what I was going to add. Is I think there's a real opportunity for states, counties, and local municipalities to step up and fill that void if the federal tap were to be turned off in that regard. And not just, we've been talking a lot about in front of the meter utility scale, but there's also a real opportunity on behind the meter, local distributed generation and
Sure, smaller projects.
Absolutely.
Yep, absolutely.
And so I think we've seen that trend continue with regional and international airports stepping up in that space on like behind the meter, and even private developers for not just data centers. I think that's where people's mind usually go when you're talking behind the meter generation, but housing developments and industrial parks, right? So
And medical facilities too, or
absolutely,
hospitals.
yeah. So this
Big campuses.
the genie's been let out of the bottle a little bit in that. And I think it'll be difficult
It's hard to wind it
recork
back. It really is. And so when you think about them encouraging oil and gas and more traditional generation, we are far down the road with a much more diverse amount of generation. It will be hard for them to gear up in the time frame they would need to with traditional generation. It's just not possible. And you think of those coal plants, then that means we're opening up a whole new, extraction, mining facilities that maybe haven't been.
Not feasible.
It's not feasible. It probably
And the
costs
dollars
more
aren't
money.
there.
No,
so this is
right.
the thing, is like if you talk to people in the oil and gas community, a lot of folks are saying, well, oil and gas prices aren't high enough for us to go out and go put
That's
a new
right.
rig out somewhere to drill somewhere for new oil. It's not, cost benefit to us is not good, right? So why would a corporation go out and do that? They wouldn't, right? And again, a lot of these folks have already diversified to the point where they don't necessarily need that. They've got enough stake in renewables in other ways that makes up for that imbalance in their books. And so I think it was, oh man, I might get misquoted here, but I think it was Chevron. It was a big oil and gas company recently laid off quite a few people, right? Even despite all of this, new administrative changes, right? So I don't think it's not going to roll back. We're not going to roll back to the point where all we're doing is just drilling for oil and gas. The money's not there. And to that point, OPEC sets those prices, not the U.S. federal government.
Right.
And we already produce the most in the world.
We do.
just, I think we lose sight of the amount that we're already producing.
Yeah.
And exporting.
And exporting. Yes.
Coming back to the tax credit scenario a little bit, obviously our clients are often concerned on will that go away, how quickly will that go away. I don't think there'll be a pause at all, like I already mentioned, but one statistic came out again last week in Houston. I think it was Chris Wright, actually, our energy director, indicated that the 80% of the investment, 80% of the tax credit benefit went to Republican communities, went to Republican districts, House and Senate districts. So once we get past this 60 or 90 day shock period, I think you'll see that balance out because no question.
Yeah, the clawback
this
on those funds is going to be
Republican
complete.
preference will.
Well, I mean,
uphill
that's
battle.
where these projects are built, is in rural communities that require and need the tax dollars. So, I mean, it's a significant benefit that I don't think we really, I don't think we put that in the forefront enough, because it really is beneficial to so many rural communities to have these projects in their communities.
Well, and this goes, Dirk, to your point about the rollback of environmental justice and the emphasis that has been put on trying to rectify the things that have happened to disadvantaged communities over the years when it comes to energy in particular. The bill in the IRA all had a lot of money tied to putting projects in the rural areas, in underserved communities, which is a very wide-ranging definition on what's underserved, right? People think like it's a traditionally Black community, Hispanic community, but it's also rural communities, poor white communities. It really encompasses a lot of different demographics.
And communities impacted by coal closures and fossil fuel as well.
Native nations as well is in that. There was a lot of money that was given out through these funding sources to these communities. I think it was something along the line of between 22 and 23, $192 billion in grants and loans from the federal government went to these communities. It was big. It also benefited, though, some of our clients that do this type of work in these rural communities. So a really good example is the USDA Rural Development has a loan and grant program for farmers to be able to have their own electrification of their farms that doesn't rely so much on the grid, right? So doing individual solar panels, small wind development, et cetera. That money's been put on pause. It's likely going to come back because I think it was to your point, Bobby, his constituents are in places that are rural and white, and they also need the support and the help. And so I would hope that that money would come back and start flowing again. The language around that might look a little different than what we've been used to when it comes to calling these communities underserved, disadvantaged, et cetera. It might just change a little bit, and we're seeing that now with the DEI language kind of getting scrubbed out of everything, and unfortunately, EJ has been tied to DEI, for better or for worse, so it's kind of getting wrapped up in all of this kind of anti-wokeness, if you will. But I would anticipate that there would be a renewed interest in trying to refund some of these programs moving forward, even though we're on pause at the moment.
Even if the funding doesn't impact, Chelsea, the way you mentioned, the need for community solar, and especially the need for community battery backup, is really huge with storm events, with what we had in the last week.
Yes.
Change.
Don't say that word.
Don't say that word.
Not climate change. Shifting environment. I don't know. Bigger storm events. I don't know.
Global climate instability.
Instability.
There
Good.
you go. Perfect.
From the client base that I'm working at here at ECT, we've seen so much more battery storage effort in the last 6 months than the gigawatt utility scale solars tremendously increasing. And statistics will show, I think it'll be increasing for quite some time, at least through 2028.
Our involvement in battery storage projects from 2023 to 2024 increased fourfold, actually,
Yeah, it was
across the nation from ACT's perspective. So.
I mean, ERCOT is such a poster child in that, right? From Winter Storm Uri in February 2021, I believe, if I'm getting that date right, to the rolling brownouts occurring there, to we just had, the state of Texas just had 2 back-to-back winter storms in February of 2025, and we saw no ERCOT closures or rolling shutdowns. And the reason for that, it was attributed to increased battery storage capabilities in ERCOT. So that, again, goes playing into peak generation versus peak demand and being able to store for that and release in 4-hour batteries, right? There's, so I think you're going to continue to see, maybe not at the federal level, but ISO-specific incentives to do that. So if ERCOT recognizes that's a need that they'll have, that ISO should hopefully step up into that space and incentivize those developments.
Are we seeing, sorry, Dirk?
Just back to your very first question, it's the transmission line corridor. It's the distribution of this electricity. It's community solar being interconnected with, that is in there.
It is in there.
He talks about natural gas pipelines and transmission line corridors, but it really is electrical corridors, no matter how you want to put it. So I expect a tremendous increase in easier permit availability, quicker permit turns for any corridors type approach, any transmission line approach.
And we require, the grid, transmission and distribution grids, they're outdated. They require a tremendous amount of work on them. And then if you tie in all the new generation with what is already outdated, the transmission sector is in need of faster permitting the schedules. They're in need of more development.
Well, globally, the trend is absolutely toward decentralized energy, and we're seeing that in the U.S. as well, too, just like we talked about with battery storage, solar, multiple energy resources.